Good evening. Mark, don't think that you're weird that you can't do this and sing at the same time because I can do this, but I can't do this and sing at the same time. That's so you're not alone in that. Appreciate Mark filling in for Mark. Um, for leading singing tonight, and good to have you here with us. We've been going through a series of lessons called Science in the Bible, and we're going to look at some more of that tonight with regards to moral law and requiring us to have a lawgiver. We've looked at some of the things with regards to evolution and what's wrong with evolution. We've talked about some of the assumptions of evolution. We've talked about the incompatibility of the idea of theistic evolution, that God didn't need Darwin to be able to create everything that we have. We've talked about the cosmological argument, the fact that there's something here at all means that there's got to be a creator, and a creator that is a sufficient cause for the effect that we see. And so tonight we're going to talk about morals and things that are right and wrong, and where does that sense of right and wrong come from, and who is it that gets to decide that ultimately. Um, this is an old picture of the town of Liberal, Missouri. I don't know if you know about the town of Liberal, Missouri or not, but the town was started as an atheist free thinker utopia in 1880 by a man by the name of George Walzer. George Walzer basically bought 2,000 acres of land out in Missouri and decided he was going to build a town there, and he was going to invite only people who were like him, only people who were atheists could come. There was no religious people that were allowed to be there. And so they wanted to found a town without a church where unbelievers could bring up their children without religious training, and where Christians were not allowed. And so that was the idea of this town as it got started. The idea was to build up a town that should exclusively be the home of infidels. Now, that's what they called themselves, was infidels. They didn't want any religious folks to be there. A town that should have not God or hell or church nor saloon. Some of the early inhabitants of Liberal even encouraged other infidels to move into their town by publishing an advertisement which boasted that Liberal is the only town of its size in the United States without a priest, preacher, church, saloon, God, Jesus, hell, or the devil. As if you could legislate something like that to say, okay, we're going to have this town, there's no God. Well, okay. So he established this town of Liberal, Missouri in 1880. 5 years later, a man by the name of Clark Braden came to Liberal, Missouri to see how it was doing. And he was a writer, he was a newspaper writer. His name was Clark Braden. And so he came to Liberal and soon wrote about what it is that he saw. His writings about the town were in an article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on May the 2nd, 1885, and were titled An Infidel Experiment. Here's what Braden had to say about the town of Liberal, Missouri. The boast about the sobriety of the town is false, but few of the infidels are total abstainers. Liquor can be obtained at 3 different places in this town of 300 people. So they weren't going to have any saloons, but they had 3 different places in a town of 300 people where you could purchase alcohol. More drunken infidels can be seen in a year in Liberal than drunken Christians, among 100 times as many church members during the same time. So apparently they had a lot of drunkenness that was there. He said, swearing is the common form of speech in Liberal, and nearly every inhabitant, old and young, swears habitually. Girls and boys swear on the streets, playground, and at home. This is 1885. Right, so we're not talking about 1985. We're not talking about 2025. 1885. That most of the folks in town sweared. Fully half of the females will swear, and a large number swear habitually. Lack of reverence for parents and of obedience to them is the rule. There are more people living together who have former companions living than any other town of 10 times the population. So you had a lot of folks that were living together, and it wasn't their first marriage, if you will. A good portion of the few books that are read are of the class that decency keeps under lock and key. He noticed in town that there was also a lot of promiscuity. There was a lot of prostitution that would take place, which leads to the next thing that he noticed. Since Liberal has started, there has not been an average of 1 birth per year. So you got these people that are living in liberal, but they don't even average one birth per year for the 5 years that the town's been established. Feticide, that's basically abortion. Feticide, he said, is universal. The physicians of the place say that a large portion of their practice has been to try to save females from the consequences of feticide. So abortion wasn't legal in 1885, right? And so they were aborting their babies, and they were doing it in a way that the women then required medical care to try to save their lives. He says, in no town is slander more prevalent, nor the charges more vile. If one were to accept what the inhabitants say of each other, he would conclude that there is a hell and that it's in liberal Missouri and that its inhabitants are devils. That was what he wrote. And so it begs the question, I think, of who gets to determine what is right or what is wrong. Here's a whole town, an experiment, if you will, of a whole town that's trying to basically have everybody do whatever it is that they think is right, whatever it is that they think is the right way. And they're not wanting to include God in their lives. They're not wanting to include God in their locality, but they're doing things that we would look at and say are vile and disgusting and not correct. And that's how Braden looked at it when he saw what was going on just 5 years later. And so it begs the question, well, how do we really determine what is right and what is wrong? And I realize that the arrow there for the right way points to the left, not the right. It probably should be the other. It probably should have. If I reverse the picture, though, it reverses the writing on there, and so it doesn't look right. But there's a right way and there's a wrong way, and how do we determine what's the right way and what's the wrong way? Is it up to us? Is it up to individual choice for us to determine what it is that's right and what it is that's wrong? If it's up to each person to determine that, then you would say that nothing could be determined to be wrong, because what I think is right or wrong and what you think is right or wrong, they may differ, right? So there wouldn't be any universal right or wrong. And in fact, the scriptures tell us that we can't determine for ourselves. Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23, Jeremiah says, I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man who walks to direct his steps. So for us to determine ourselves that here's how we're going to walk, here's how we're going to determine what's right or what's wrong, we don't have it in us. Man doesn't have the capacity to be able to be a lawgiver, to give a moral law, if you will, to be the one to do that, because we're going to find things that we think are okay. We're going to be convinced maybe in our mind, we're going to be convinced maybe in our heart that this is the right thing to do, but it may not be God's thing that he wants us to do. It may not be God's way. It may not, in essence, be the absolute right thing to do. The Proverbs writer talks about that in Proverbs 14:12. He says, there's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. So there are times where we think, okay, this is the right way. This is what we think we ought to do, but it's a way that leads to death because it's not according to what God would have us to do or what God would have us to believe. And so when people make their own rules, it leads to a lot of hypocrisy, doesn't it? It leads to a lot of folks saying, well, it's okay for me to do this, but it's not okay for somebody else to do this. People who are thieves lock their stuff up so that it doesn't get stolen. Thieves don't want to have their things stolen. And so somebody who says, well, it's okay for me to be a thief, it's okay for me to steal something, I'm violated if somebody else steals my stuff. Well, in their reactions, you kind of see where their heart really is, right? When push comes to shove, you see, well, thievery, theft, right, must be wrong because you feel wronged when somebody takes your stuff, but yet you still think that it's okay for you to go and steal from others. Well, that's not practicing the golden rule, right? That's not treating others the way that you would want to be treated if you don't want your stuff stolen, but you think it's okay for you to steal somebody else's things. And so if we leave it up to us, it's going to be difficult for us to have a standard of what's right and what's wrong because everyone's going to come to a different conclusion. Everyone's going to maybe have a different idea. And when you start telling folks that what it is that they're doing is wrong, even if you're telling them, well, it's wrong because God says that it's wrong, many times folks are going to say to you, well, who are you? Who are you to say what is right or what is wrong? And they're right. No pun intended. Who are we to say it's not upon us. It's not upon what we think. It's not upon what we believe. It's not upon what we feel that determines what is right or what's wrong. It's not left up to us. Just like it's not left up to those that are telling us that we don't have the right to tell them. They don't have the right to tell us what's right or wrong either, because it's not in man. Man doesn't have the capacity to be able to determine what it is that's right and what it is that's wrong. So if it's not in us as individuals to determine right or wrong, what about us collectively? Is it okay if the community decides what it is that's right and what it is that's wrong? We'll go to the ballot box and we'll vote on this, and whoever whatever the majority decides, right? If it's 51%, or I guess you only need to have 50% plus one person, right, in order to win the ballot, if you will, or win at the ballot box. But the majority maybe feel like what they're able to decide what's right and what's wrong. So is that any better? Well, we still don't get any absolutes this way. Still don't have any absolutes of what's right or what's wrong. If it's left up to the community, if it's left up to people to vote for it, you still don't have any absolutes of things that are right or that are wrong. Because if you use culture, right, if you use your locality as the source of objective morals, then here's what you might end up with. If they feel that some of these activities are okay, they could, if 51% agree, could pass laws to say, well, cannibalism could be deemed to be morally acceptable. There are places where cannibalism is practiced, right? The majority of that society feels that it's okay to be a cannibal. And so is that morally acceptable because 51% of the folks think that that's okay? What if they think that murder can be morally acceptable, that it's okay to go ahead and kill someone else? If they vote for that, and if the community decides, is that okay? Does that make it right because 51% of the community thinks that it's okay? What if they were to say unforgiveness is morally acceptable? You don't have to forgive other people. You can go get even because murder is acceptable now too, right? So you can go and get your revenge for that. What if they deemed that rape was morally acceptable? Would that make it okay? Would it make it all right for those activities to take place? What about killing innocent unborn babies? Can we make that morally acceptable? You see, communities can vote on these things and they can make them legal in their particular communities, but it doesn't mean that it's morally acceptable. It doesn't mean that it's morally right. It doesn't mean that it's something that we ought to do. And let's say one community says, well, cannibalism's okay, and another community says, no, cannibalism isn't okay. Well, which is it? Which one's right? Which one's wrong? Right? How do you make that determination? Which is it? And when you think about this particular system, that's more or less where we are in the United States right now with regards to the issue of abortion. We don't have an objective, this is morally right, or an objective, this is morally wrong with regards to the laws in our society. This is more or less what it is that we have with abortion in the United States. We're going to take a vote and see what the majority of the people think about it. Now, what we have now is better than what we had for 51 years with Roe versus Wade, because Roe versus Wade, it was the law of the land everywhere in the United States. And so what we have now is better. At least some communities are able to put some stipulations together on that. But it's left up to each community to decide what is right or what is wrong with regards to that issue. Well, is there a moral standard? Is there a moral standard that we ought to adhere to? Is there a moral standard that comes from someplace else beyond the community? What if the community changes its mind? Does it make it right that they're voting to do this? Does it make it right just because it's legal to do some of these things? What if a community changes its mind? There's an arbitrariness that comes when the community decides what's morally right or what's morally wrong. I think that we saw that during COVID, didn't we? The arbitrary nature of things that people said, okay, well, you don't have to wear a mask. Oh, no, you do have to wear a mask. You've got to be 6 feet apart from one another. You can't have any large groups. You can't sing in the church building because you're throwing germs out of your mouth when you sing. And so all these different regulations that came about that the government's trying to determine what people can do and what people can't do. And you think about the arbitrary nature of it. There were rules that if you were outside, right? So you're outdoors and you're 6 feet apart from other people, that you had to wear a mask while you were 6 feet apart from other people outside. But if you got on one of those roller coasters, right, and you're going to be screaming your lungs out, and the people that are riding the ride in the seats behind you are going to pass through that same airspace, right? They're going to come zooming through there just as you're screaming your lungs out. You could take your mask off while you're on the roller coaster. Well, how much sense does that make? Right? When you start thinking about that logically, you start thinking about that scientifically. And so there's some arbitrariness. And so you can't have a system that like this that's going to determine, well, this is what's morally right and this is what's morally wrong, because it's all based on the whims of the community. So what does that leave us with? If individuals can't be the ones who make that determination as to what's right or what's wrong, and the community can't be the one to decide what's morally right and what's morally wrong, then it has to come from somewhere else. There has to be a higher power that it comes from. And that's what was appealed to during the Nuremberg trials after World War II. During the trials at Nuremberg, the Nazi defense attorneys argued that Hitler's soldiers who were on trial were only following the orders of their society and should therefore not be held accountable. They said, look, we were just following orders. We killed all these people at Auschwitz and we did all these horrible things during the war, but we were just following orders. It wasn't our fault. Well, did they accept that at Nuremberg? Did they say, oh, okay, that's, your society deemed that that was acceptable behavior, and so that's okay? No, they appealed to a higher law. They appealed to a higher power. A judge countered that argument with the question, but sir, is there not a law above our laws? Is there not another law that's above the laws of nations that you should have known that that was a wrong thing to do? You should have known that that wasn't the way to treat other people. It's the only way that we can have an absolute sense of what's right or what's wrong. We need an ultimate authority to appeal to that is above individuals in society. An ultimate authority. One that can have an absolute standard, that can put that together and have an absolute standard that way. And so we need to have that absolute sense of what's right or what's wrong. And that doesn't come from us, and it doesn't come from the community. It doesn't come from society, but it has to come from God. It has to come from a higher power in order to say, here's what's right and here's what's wrong, and to be that arbiter, if you will. And so if it comes from a higher power, if it comes from an absolute standard, well, now it's not arbitrary. Now it's not based on nothing, right? Now it's not based on the whims of the people. Now it's going to be based on what's best for us, because God's always going to have what's best for us in mind, and the rules and the regulations and the laws and the things that he says that we are to do and the things that he says we aren't to do. It's always for our good, always, that those things exist. We need that in order to understand what is right and what is wrong. Paul understood that in writing to the Romans in Romans chapter 7 and verse 7. Paul says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. How did Paul know what was right and what was wrong? Because the law had it in there. You shall do this, you shall not do that. Came from God. It came from a higher power. It came from an absolute standard and an absolute authority. And so Paul could know what was right and what was wrong, not from his own feelings, not from his own ideas, not from the 51% of the community that he lived in, but because it came from God, because it came from that absolute authority. And so when we think about evolution and we think about the idea of Darwinian evolution, that we are just glorified animals, that we are just part of the animal kingdom, that there's no higher power, there's no higher authority to answer to, there are some consequences for that particular belief. There are some things that that's going to lead to. And so what is the natural conclusion of this idea of survival of the fittest and moral right and moral wrong? Because if you're just going by the survival of the fittest and saying, well, only the strong are going to survive, and there's no higher authority, there's no higher power that we need to answer to, then who's to say that if I'm stronger than you, that I shouldn't come into your house and beat you up and take your stuff? Who's to say that if I'm angry enough that I can't kill you if I'm stronger than you are, right? Because if there's no higher power, if there's no higher authority to answer to, well, then who's going to say what's right or what's wrong? If I believe in the survival of the fittest and that we're just a bunch of animals, then why would I do something that's not going to please me? Why would I do something that's going to maybe hurt me or cost me for the benefit of somebody else? Why would I do that if there's no higher power to answer to? There'd be no logic in helping others at my expense if there is no higher power. And so this idea of Darwinian evolution and that people are animals, that there's this evolutionary process that takes place, it leads to racism ultimately. Because some folks are going to say, well, we're more evolved than these other folks are. These other folks haven't evolved as much. And that's exactly what we see that it led to with regards to Nazi Germany. Now, before the Nazis came to power, That there were doctors and others that were in Germany that had deemed people that had some inferiority, maybe they had some disease or they had some mental issues, they deemed them to be useless eaters. Just think about that. Now, this is before Nazi Germany. They deemed them to be useless eaters. And since they're looking at human beings through the lens of economics, they could say, well, these people, they're not contributing anything to society. They're just kind of weighing society down. They're taking up resources. They're useless eaters. They're eating the food that should go to somebody that's being productive in society. And what are they doing? Well, they're trying to justify the idea that we're going to euthanize these folks, right? That we're going to eliminate these folks, that we're going to get rid of them. And so this idea of useless eaters was in German medicine, if you will, before the Nazis came to power. So they were practicing some of the things that the Nazis would take to the next level, because now the Nazis made it racial. They said, well, these races are inferior. They're not as evolved as we are. They're not as fit as we are. And it's survival of the fittest, right? And so we're going to get rid of these inferior races because we don't want them to perpetuate. We don't want them to perpetuate. And so that led to something else. It led to eugenics. It's hard to believe eugenics is over 100 years old. Margaret Sayer is one of the leaders of the eugenics movement. And basically, what they were trying to do is genetic engineering to say, all right, we don't want folks that are going to be infirm. We don't want folks that are going to have maybe some sort of defect. We don't want folks that are going to have some sort of problem. And so we're going to use eugenics. We're going to eliminate those weaker people so that we can breed more stronger people. And so the medical industry was involved with regards to eugenics. There were folks that went to get an appendix removed. They had surgery to have an appendix removed. And during the surgery, they made a determination, well, this person shouldn't be allowed to procreate because there's some sort of health issue with them. And so they went ahead and sterilized them without their knowledge. It took place. It happened. They would sterilize people so that they wouldn't continue to breed, right? Well, what are they trying to do? Well, in Germany, they were trying to create a master race. They're trying to create a master and say, well, these other races, they're inferior. And so we're going to eliminate them. We're going to have a final solution where we're going to get rid of all of those folks, right? And we're going to breed folks that are this way. And so there was sterilization of people that took place. There was a killing of mass groups of people that weren't deemed to be fit under the Nazi regime. And we say, okay, well, that's, we understand that happened in Germany, and we understand that was a very bad thing, and that couldn't happen here, right? Well, there were eugenics practiced in the United States. Margaret Sanger is the one that they look to as the founder of Planned Parenthood, which still exists. And the idea was that through the means of abortion, to keep certain groups of people from procreating so that they would not take over the population of the country, so that they could practice eugenics, if you will. And so it did happen here. In 1907, Indiana had a eugenics law. The Supreme Court ruled in 1907 that the 1907 law was unconstitutional in 1921. So there was a 1907 law practicing eugenics in Indiana that the Supreme Court ruled as unconstitutional in 1921. They cited denial of due process under the 14th Amendment. A 1927 law, though, reinstated sterilization, adding court appeals. Approximately 2,500 total in state custody were sterilized. Governor Otis R. Bowen approved repeal of all sterilization laws in 1974. By 1977, related restrictive marriage laws were also repealed. So they had laws about whether or not you could marry somebody of a different race. They had laws about, they were sterilizing folks against their will. Right? If they had, well, this panel says that they ought to be sterilized, so they were and so these eugenics laws were present in the United States. The last of them, I don't remember which state it was, but the last of them was finally taken off the books in 2014. So we say, well, that can't happen here. People don't have a sense of what's right or what's wrong. Why? Because they believe that we evolved from apes. They believe that there is no higher power that we answer to. And if there's no higher power that we answer to and we're all just a bunch of animals, well, then why shouldn't we treat each other that way? And that's exactly what they were doing. We see it in our schools. people who don't believe that there's any higher power to answer to or any higher authority. We took God out of the schools. We took prayer out of the schools. We taught them a whole generation or two that we evolved from apes and from monkeys. And so why should we be surprised when they decide that they're going to deal with their anger towards those that are bullying them by just shooting them down? Now, atheists would argue that these things are wrong. If you got into a discussion with them, they would argue that these things are wrong, but they would say that these things are wrong because they cause pain to others or that they cause injury to others, and that's what makes them wrong. And we might ask an atheist, okay, upon what authority do you say that these things are wrong? Because, and they would say, well, it causes pain to someone else. Okay, but still, by what authority would you say that this is something that's wrong? Because if you believe in Darwinian evolution, if you really believe in that, the conclusion is that there is no right and there is no wrong because there is no higher power. Nietzsche said, "You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, it does not exist." So there is no way that is the right way. There is no way that is absolutely right. There is no standard of right and wrong. It's just your way or my way. Richard Dawkins, we used some of his quotes before. He's a well-known atheist. He said, humans have always wondered about the meaning of life. He says, life has no higher purpose than to perpetuate the survival of DNA. Life has no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. What a sad world that would be to live in, wouldn't it? If that were really the case. What a sad world this would be. But if there is no authority, then nothing can be condemned as being evil or wrong. Nothing could be condemned as being evil or wrong. But atheists argue that there are some things that are wrong, and so they're not consistent. But you see, ideas have consequences. You start down that road of evolution, there's a consequence to that. It leads to other things. It leads to racism. It leads to problems with people shooting and killing one another because they don't feel like there's any higher power that we answer to. But we have something, even atheists have something where they say, well, no, that ought not to happen, right? Or that's something that's wrong. Where does that idea of oughtness come from? That idea that something bothers us when we do something that's wrong. Why is that? Well, God says this over in Jeremiah chapter 31, beginning in verse 31. He says, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, though I was a husband to them, says the Lord. But this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law in their minds, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. God was going to write the law on our hearts and our minds. Now, we do that by reading his word and by understanding. But there's something that God has given to us that we recognize when we do something that's wrong. When we do something that we think is wrong, we feel guilty, right? It pricks our conscience. It bothers us. Well, God has given us that conscience. Now, we've got to train it, right? If we don't train our conscience, then it can lead us astray. But God has given us that conscience that we understand that there are some things that are right in this world and there are some things that are wrong in this world. And it would seem that people had that, but they tended to ignore it. They tended to push that aside. Notice in Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 18, Paul here says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. What are they doing? They're suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. So they know that there's something wrong with what it is that they're doing, but they go ahead and they do it anyways. He says, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. There is something in man. We talked a couple weeks ago about those individual cells that are in our body. There's evidence in our body that God created everything because there's a design to our bodies. But there's something in us that gives us a sense, if you will, of what's right or what's wrong. It says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. They ignored what it is that God had given to them. They suppressed the truth of what it is that God had given to them. They suppressed the truth of the knowledge that they had that there has to be a creator. Even though they knew God, they did not retain him in their knowledge. In 1 Timothy, oh, I'm sorry, I meant to put those up there so you have those references if you want them. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, Paul says, "Now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron." Their conscience is going to be seared. If your conscience is seared, it no longer bothers you. You can do something that's wrong now and it doesn't bother you. When you brand cattle, you take that branding iron and you sear their flesh. It burns their flesh. And where you burn that brand into their flesh, they can no longer feel anything. So if you were to take a needle or a pin or something and you start poking that animal in that spot where they've been branded, they don't feel it. So the idea of having our conscience seared as with a hot iron means that when we do something that's wrong, it doesn't prick our conscience anymore. It doesn't bother us. Maybe we've been doing things wrong so long that we don't care anymore, and it doesn't bother us. It doesn't affect us. We don't feel that anymore. But he says that they are speaking lies in hypocrisy. So it's not just that they don't know. It's not just that they've been taught wrong. It's they know that what they're doing is wrong. They know that what they're doing is dishonest. They know that what they're doing is a lie, and yet they go ahead and they do it anyways because their conscience doesn't bother them anymore. But we have that conscience that tells us that these things are wrong. How else can you explain when you look at various different cultures in the world, some that are Christian cultures, some that are maybe Muslim cultures, some that are atheistic cultures? When you look at all these different societies within the world, is murder legal in any of them? Is rape legal in any of them? Is theft legal in any of them? You see, they all have a basic sense of what's right or what's wrong. Where did that come from? Why do they make those laws that way? Because they've got a moral sense, if you will, that's been given to them. They've got an oughtness about it. Now, if there's no God, then there is no ought. There is no reason not to do anything. That moral law requires a lawgiver. In James chapter 4 and verse 12, it says, "There's one lawgiver who is able to save and destroy. Who are you to judge another?" There's one lawgiver who can give the law and say this is right and this is wrong. Only one lawgiver. And he's the one who's going to be the judge. He's the one who's going to be able to say, this is, you did what was right or you did what was wrong. Who are you to judge another? Now, that's not us saying, hey, God says, it's not talking about us not making any judgments about things that we see going on in the world, but we don't get to judge one another based on our own standard. The judgments that we make, we have to judge righteously. Our judgments have to be based on the Word of God. It has to be based on what the lawgiver has given us. It has to be based on according to His law. People can see the difference in what's right and what's wrong if they really are honest with themselves. This is George Walzer. He's the one who started liberal Missouri in 1880 as this atheistic utopian paradise. But later, as he saw the way that things worked out in liberal Missouri, he changed his mind. He later came to understand that there had to be a God. When he died in 1910, there were excerpts that were read from a book that he wrote that were read at his funeral. The name of the book that he wrote was titled The Life and Teachings of Jesus. So he found out, maybe the hard way, that there is a God. And it's a good thing that there's a God because God's the one who determines what is right and what is wrong. Since we have a higher moral law than just the laws of mankind, there has to be a moral lawgiver. There has to be someone who lays down that law because there is a moral law that is there. Individuals are not sufficient in determining what's right and what's wrong. We don't have the hubris, if you will, to be able to determine what's right or what's wrong. There will be no agreement. There'll be no universal standard if it's just left up to each one of us to decide. Majority of society is not sufficient either to determine what is morally right and what is morally wrong because the crowd is fickle, aren't they? The crowd is fickle. Here's Jesus, and he's coming into Jerusalem, and They're laying down palm leaves in front of him, right? And he's riding in on the donkey, and they're singing and they're shouting, "Glory to God in the highest! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" Right? They're praising him as he's coming into Jerusalem. And less than a week later, they're going to be shouting to crucify him. She can't go by what the majority of people think as to what's right and what's wrong. There's only one sufficient source for morals, one absolute authority on the subject. God provides the only objective standard for moral values. God provides the only authority for enforcing the oughtness of moral duties. He's the one who created it all, and he's the one who gets to decide what's right and what's wrong. So as we look at this tonight, it gives us some evidence of a creator, but it's not something that we would maybe hang our hat on the totality of this particular argument. But when we start putting all the things together with regards to design requires a designer, a moral law design requires a moral lawgiver. The fact that there's assumptions that are baked into the evolutionary dates for how old everything is. When you start seeing the scientific impossibility of evolution and start understanding that, well, Darwin didn't know what the cells were like and that this has to be designed by somebody because it doesn't just happen by accident. You start putting all these things together, you have a cumulative argument for the existence of God. And so hopefully this is helping us to build our faith and to strengthen our faith and to understand that we're not stupid for believing in God. And we're not stupid for believing that God created everything, because even science shows us that that has to be the case. There has to be a creator for all of this. Next week, we'll finish this series up. We'll have one more lesson on, it's referred to as the Christological argument, but basically has to do with the fact that because Jesus Christ existed and lived and was resurrected, that proves the existence of God as well. And we'll look at that next week. But if you're here tonight and you've not become a Christian, if you've not obeyed the gospel, and what it is that God tells us that we need to do, understand that he is our creator and he is the lawgiver and he's the one who specifies, here's what it is that we need to do in order to be saved. And if we do these other things, then we're going to be lost. And so it has to be according to his law. It has to be according to what he has specified, because he's the absolute authority. And it's not based on what I think. It's not based on what I believe. It's not based on what this community thinks or believes. It's based on what God has given us in his word. If you're here tonight and you've not yet become a Christian, we can help you with that, whether it's to study with you or whether it's to baptize you for the remission of your sins. If you've wandered away from the faith and you need the prayers of the saints, we invite you to come forward now as we stand with Marcus and as we sing.